Hi, everyone. Welcome to our quarter two book club session. This one is on the book Feminist AI, which was proposed by Eva, but chosen by the group as usual. Um, We'll go through the basics. Just so you know, the meeting is being recorded. You do not have to turn your camera on. You do not have to speak. You can remain as anonymous as you wish, and it's also okay to just communicate via the chat. It's entirely up to you. As always, we want to ensure an inclusive environment. So please, let's keep all our disagreements, if we have any, inclusive and peaceful. I don't want to have to boot anybody from the chat or the call, but if I do, you're welcome to come back another time. If you are outside the panel, just raise your hand, and Eva and I will acknowledge and take questions throughout and also at the end. There's usually three of us. Unfortunately, something came up at the last minute for Maria, and she'll not be able to join us. So it will just be Eva and I. So I will let Eva start with her introduction.
Hi, I'm Eva. I'm a PhD candidate at GCAS, and I'm focusing on the intersection of AI automation, future of work, and contemporary meaning crisis. So we talk a lot about AI anxiety or AI-derived displacement at work. And I examine this from the perspective that goes beyond just fear of job loss or economic concerns, but studying the impact on identity and meaning. So really more an existential aspect. And through this, I also pay a lot of attention to embodiment and the role of the body in the context of AI and challenging the perception of AI as immaterial. And Tessina, you want to give an introduction as well?
No, I never want to introduce myself. I am Tessina Moloney, and I'm also a GCAS PhD researcher. I am, like Eva, studying AI ethics, but probably from a different angle. I'm looking at the impact of AI and automation on the labor market, specifically as it relates to women and marginalized groups, and how AI affects job security or job insecurity, and how that may also lead to economic instability for a lot of people over time. So with that said, we can get started on the book. Eva, you said you wanted to introduce the book, right? All right, floor is all yours.
I'm really excited about this book. I had this feeling before, but after reading, I think it's a really great overview of critical perspectives on AI and specifically feminist perspectives. So it's really sort of a menu to choose from and explore different approaches that I think is very relevant today. The book was published in 2023, so it's fairly recent. It's more than 20 essays that were edited by Jude, Browne, Stephen Cave, Eleanor, Drage, and Kerry McInerney. Worth mentioning the editors, I think. So what they say is feminist AI, critical perspective on algorithms, data, and intelligent machines is the first volume to bring together leading feminist thinkers from across the disciplines to explore the impact of artificial intelligence and related data-driven technologies on human society. So again, I think it's very relevant and very rich because there is a lot of ground to cover. Both Tessina and I will focus on a deep dive into one essay, but we can start by going through some other comments and notes that came up along the way. And I would really encourage you to participate and interact. There is really so much going on in this book, and would love to know your perspectives as well.
Okay, so as Eva said, there's a lot of chapters. and we're not going to touch on all of them. In fact, we're going to start by skipping the first chapter because when we did our paper session last month, that actually was the first chapter of the book. So we'll start with the second chapter, which was making kin with the machines. And that one I just made some notes. We're not going to do a full presentation on it. So that one discussed an indigenous approach to coexistence with machines that use artificial intelligence as just another form of non-human kin by accepting that humankind isn't the center of the universe. This is a concept that I think we encountered before with psychoanalysis of AI, where there was this focus on, or this attempt to persuade us not to view humanity as like the benchmark by which we should judge all other, I don't want to say organisms because AI is not organic, but you get what I mean, the beings that we have. However, the paper acknowledges that there is currently an imbalance in the relationship between technology and humans, and that AI has helped concentrate wealth in the hands of developers and creators. So it's important to note that this application of Indigenous lens to AI does not reflect what the Indigenous community thinks as a whole, or even what one tribe thought. It is just an approach that was proposed by one researcher who was tied to the Indigenous community. I thought it was a very interesting take because the Indigenous community in the US does have a very different way of looking at existence and coexistence, how you exist with nature and non-human versus human organisms. But I guess I never really considered how they would approach a completely non-living thing that also has some kind of at least simulated human characteristics like artificial intelligence. And in the paper, the researcher did mention that there were some people from the community who were absolutely against the idea, but I still thought it was an interesting take. Did you have any notes on that one, Eva?
Yeah, I think it's one of the papers that I would recommend the most. And not necessarily because we need to agree, but just as an opportunity to expand our thinking. And I think that thinking these indigenous epistemologies is really valuable, and just going outside of mainstream narratives and outside of narratives imposed by big tech is just really can just help us to think in new ways. So I found it really valuable from this perspective and would recommend.
I agree. I think it also kind of goes back to the first book we did, the AI Con, where there was this framing of AI boosters or people who thought AI would be a good thing versus the ones who thought it would be a bad thing. And there was this framing from the authors that it's mostly white, male, wealthy person have any positive ideology attached to artificial intelligence. And at the time, my criticism was that I felt the book was extremely limiting in deciding what minorities or marginalized people thought. That was one of my main complaints. And so this book kind of illustrates the point that I was making. This is clearly not a white male persona who is giving this opinion. And also, I thought it was interesting because in the first chapter, the author had said, was it Donna Haraway who had asked for us to make kin with the machines? And that paper criticized whether or not that was possible. And so it was interesting that the chapter that follows next actually proposes the opposite argument, that it is possible. So it's just another way to show how in the book there's so many diverse perspectives and they don't all agree with each other. So I think it's a really good way to get to be exposed to different ideas about AI. I did not have any notes on 3, 4, or 5. What about you, Eva?
No, not in particular. We can move on to 6.
Did anybody else check on those? Lucia, I know you said that you had read and I saw your little notes in the book. Did you want us to skip 3, 4, and 5 as well?
Yeah, I think, let me see, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, I don't have anything relevant for those.
Okay, so then the next one is 6, which was No Humans in the Loop, Killer Robots, Race, and AI. The topic grabbed my attention immediately. And I initially thought this was the book that I might choose, or the paper that I might choose from the book. But I actually didn't like the paper all that much, to be honest. I felt like it was just really, really dense. And I had to make it halfway through before I decided whether it was really relevant or not. But it does make a very interesting claim, and I like that it ventured into AI safety aspects and not just AI ethics. If you know anything about the AI ethics and AI safety community, we operate on very different sides of the spectrum and they don't always get along. That was another premise in the AI con, that AI safety concerns is something white male privileged society have, that oh no, something bad might finally happen to us as well and not just everyone else. um, but this paper said differently. And I think one of the most important things that it said to me that stuck out was human in the loop is an inadequate safeguard against excessive violence in AI systems because humans themselves are imperfect and exhibit a tendency towards violence. Thus, the technologies are as flawed as their creators. So, in this paper, they primarily spoke about artificial intelligence in military use, I would say, or policing and surveillance, and arguing that even in the instance where you have a human decide whether or not the AI should pull the trigger, it's still likely to cause problems and be riddled with errors and bias and discrimination and prejudice about how we value different people around the world. And it does not solve the problem at all. I don't really see where the paper proposed a proper solution, but it was still an interesting discourse. Did you get the chance to look at that one, AI? Eva, No Humans in the Loop, Killer Robots.
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting one because it challenged the focus and the debate whether or not we should have killer robots with human out of the loop, right? Saying the fact that there is a human in the loop is not a guarantee of any kind of neutrality or equality because of the particular kind of human that this might be who is controlling the technology, and also how people on the other side are being dehumanized in different ways to justify using AI in military context, right? So talking about what was it? Talking about human shields, for example, and various ways of dehumanizing people on the other side to make this justified. In general, I strongly kind of dislike or am annoyed by the human in the loop or human out of the loop distinction. I know that this is not strictly theoretically correct, but I always want to challenge the idea that there is truly human out of the loop experience because of humans being involved in creation and making AI possible at every step of the way in the background.
I agree. I think that when they use it, it's specifically towards the end. The end final decision is when people start thinking about humans in the loop or in the fine-tuning process. But it does kind of erase the human aspect of AI in a sense by implying that there were no humans involved in getting to that point in the first place. So I agree with you. I have no notes on 7 either, which was Coding Carnal Knowledge into Carceral Systems, a feminist abolitionist approach to predictive policing. But I did have notes on 8. Did you have notes on 7?
No, go ahead. We can focus on 9 as for me, so you can go ahead with 8.
Yeah, I don't have any on 9, so that one is all yours. But for 8, techno-racial capitalism, a decolonial Black feminist Marxist perspective. And what stood out for me with this one, it says billions of racialized people in the world have no say as their livelihoods become increasingly intertwined with AI and machine learning. And that people also have little or no control over data mining. And companies have made the right to mine data a necessary condition of using their products and services. So whether it's a video game or your email service, whatever it is, there's always the terms and conditions that tell you how they're going to use your data, and you really don't have an opportunity to decline and still use the service. Or in the few instances where that might be allowed, the service is stripped of so many things that it's basically useless to you. So it's not really a choice, is it? Um, It also says, consequently, technology and big tech has helped to maintain capitalism imperialism. So the paper points out especially the role that exploitation has played in undermining Africa's attempt for independence, and discusses the interconnectedness of race or racism and capitalism. And I thought that was really interesting because when I did history as a class in Jamaica at college level, we had to read this book called Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams. And he was one of the first authors, at least that I came across, that discussed that, the role that slavery paid or played in funding capitalism, that even the Industrial Revolution would not have been possible if there wasn't free labor on the back end that was pushing that development. And the paper says Africa is not poor. Africa is rich. Africa's people are poor. Europe and North America set prices on goods produced by Africans while also setting the prices for their own goods, which suppresses Africa's economies, refusing Africans economic sovereignty and creating a dynamic of dependence on capitalist imperialist economies. So basically, in this economic setting that we have, the more privileged populations, which would be North America and Europe, have basically rigged the game for their own benefit. They get to play the game, but they also get to set the rules by which the games are played, which in economy is the prices or the means by which you get the basic ingredients, like mining for things, the things that we use that build our phones and the data centers and everything. So I thought that was interesting. It also reminds me of another book that we had to read when I did history in Jamaica. And this one was in high school. And it was How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And it was an entire theory on how Africa was exploited again to build European nations and North African nations, North American nations at the expense of Africa itself. So it has been a long time since I've come across those concepts again. So this paper was really interesting to me. And I will let Eva take 9 because I don't have notes on that one. And 9 is Feminist Techno-Futures Contesting the Ethics and Politics of Sex, Robots, and AI.
Yeah, thanks. So we talk about sex robots more than I expected we would when we started the club, that's for sure. And so in this paper, the author talks about how the discourse surrounding sex robots is shaped by technoliberalism. And she critiques 2 dominant approaches to robot ethics. And one says we need to ban sex robots. And this is the liberal judicial approach. And so this approach says this promotes objectification of women and just reinforces the idea that women are programmable property. This contributes to the fear that women are becoming property, and also has appropriates the violent history of slavery and promotes normative white womanhood. And then we have the approach of technoliberal diversity consumerist approach that says we can overcome the bias and the lack of diversity of these sex robots defaulting to mostly white women if we include people of color or transgender sex dolls. And here the author warns that this is just another form of commodifying human difference for profit, just treating race and gender as attributes without addressing structural inequalities of racial capitalism. And then the author calls for queer feminist approach. And here she gives an example of Lauren AI, in which the artist actually pretends to be AI, an AI smart home assistant. And she explores themes like inefficiency and need for rest to confront people's attitude of expectations about servitude, domination, and challenge these relations that are also based on colonialism on some way.
I'm not surprised that you picked that one. I actually thought that was the one you would present on, to be honest.
I mean, I'm developing a brand.
You're developing a brand. I really thought that's the one you'd have chosen, and I was scanning through the topics. But does anybody else want to say anything before we move on to the others? Because they're just not connected. Everything is so different, and you can still ask questions at the end, but we're still making the space now if you have questions or comments on the 9 topics that we've gone over so far. Okay, Eva, the floor is yours for 10. That's the one you're presenting on, right? Yeah.
Yes. This is going to be great because I have technical issues and I don't have my notes. So I'm going to just share some notes for us. Let's see. Hold on. Not sure if you, no, I have access. Okay, that's great. Do you see just a window or you see my entire screen? You see, what do you see? Just a presentation? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I can see the link as well.
Yeah, but it's just one window, right?
Yeah, just the window.
Oh, okay, that's great. So I chose this essay about care and AI and feminized labor because I have actually been writing about feminization of care and feminization of AI and care and AI. Last year, I wrote an essay about it, and when I've read this one, I realized that there was an aspect of this issue that I wasn't really exploring, and that aspect was race. So I definitely was focusing on, how AI and care is feminized. But this essay really adds this important layer, which I think is really valuable to understand. And the second reason for me choosing this essay is the fact that it's just incredibly rich in very interesting and relevant concepts that we haven't really explored in the book club so far. And so the author of the essay is Jennifer Rhee. She also wrote a book that seems really interesting called The Robotic Imaginary. The Human and the Price of Dehumanized Labor. And so this essay consists of three main parts. And in the first one, the author takes us back to the first chatbot, which was Eliza. And in the second part, we will talk about the assistants of today that are still very much shaped by the environment in which Eliza was developed in the 60s. And then in the last part, she talks about the artwork sort of challenging these narratives and devaluing and feminization of labor in AI. So the essay begins, interestingly, talking about Turing and his seminal paper, which is the same paper in which he introduced the imitation game. But the author addresses it from a different perspective, which is the perspective of care and care labor. So in this paper, Turing suggested that rather than trying to simulate an adult brain, we can develop a child brain, which will then be educated to produce a simulation of the adult brain. So there is education and effort and care involved in order to bring up the AI effectively. And so the author introduces the concept of care labor, which he describes as the work of providing care to others by attending to their physical, emotional, and educational well-being. And she talks about this labor being sometimes paid, like teachers, childcare, housekeepers, nurses, but also acknowledging that it often includes unpaid labor that takes care of the material and emotional needs, but is made invisible and is not valued. And she says that racial and gendered hierarchies structure both care, labor, and AI. And of course, very happily will give a shout out to Silvia Federici that is being mentioned. So one of the most important aspects of this devalued care labor is related to Federici's labor power. So Federici talks about the valuation of reproductive work that has been one of the pillars of capital accumulation and the capitalistic exploitation of women's labor. What does it mean? It means that for the capitalist system to have access to workers which can be employed / exploited, these workers need to be born, which is, the job of women, and they also need to be taken care of in various ways so they can be productive. So that's cooking and all the housework and so on. And that's kind of the prelude to introducing Eliza, which was the first chatbot developed in the 60s. And it was modeled on Rogerian therapy, which kind of used repeating questions to give an illusion of some kind of relating and some kind of emotional resonance, even though the technology itself was very primitive. And so the importance of Eliza, which is the first chatbot, and it gets a female name right away, is as follows. When labor associated with women's work is automated by AI, these technologies often extend the evaluation of this work while replicating care labor hierarchies based on race, gender, and citizenship. And so Eliza was actually developed by the creator as a parody of therapy, and he found with surprise and somewhat of a terror that people really bonded with Eliza to the extent that his assistant asked him to leave the room because she was having an intimate conversation, knowing very well how Eliza was programmed and its limitations. And a few things happened around the same time that kind of provide context and shape the way Eliza was created. And so therapy as a discipline started to move from this more masculine and authoritative and seemingly objective approach to a more relational and empathetic. And at the same time, more women started getting involved in the profession. So what was the result of that? Voices started to emerge that started to devalue the profession of therapy. So more women and women in the field equals effectively devaluing of this field and perceived value of therapy. And here the author says that it's not only that care labor here is being feminized, but it also has a racial hierarchy. And so she quotes another researcher who says that women's participation in various care labor professions increased, but the kinds of work available to women differed along racial lines. So the therapists that joined the profession were mostly white women, and white women in general had more access to white-collar managerial work that was characterized by more interaction and more visibility, and women of color held lower-paying, lower-status jobs that require physical work. And they also made a distinction between nurturing and non-nurturing care labor, saying that people of color were more involved in non-nurturing care labor, which would be more physical, rather than, for example, education. And this is a very important point that will come up later. So yes, this is deeply racialized. Care labor has been disproportionately performed by Black, Indigenous, Asian, Latinx women in the USA, but the beneficiaries of care at the time of Eliza were imagined to be white. So here the author brings another concept, which is the concept of white care. So around the time of emergence of Eliza, there is an idea that mostly, for example, white women would be providing therapy and also receiving therapy. And white care is really quite, it has a quite damning source and history, starting with racist evolutionary thought and then eugenics movement and so on. So throughout this history, consumptions of care were continuously used to justify and protect racial hierarchies, to explain evolutionary superiority of white populations. So this is really quite nasty. And so she says that this idea of white care shaped the emergence of ELISA. And from here, we're starting to look at the assistance of AI assistance of today, and rebuild this continuum between liberalism, white care, and technoliberalism. And she talks about the extension of liberal subjects through contemporary technologies and their obscuring of racialized and gender labors and hierarchies that organize racial capitalism. So we here have the introduction of technoliberalism as well, that I just want to highlight. And so as we look at the AI assistants of today, Ree points out that they are still modeled on white, middle-class, native English-speaking women, and the labor of people of color is invisibilized around the globe. And she gives examples of Chinese women assembling digital devices, young children mining for coltan in the Congo, and workers sorting and disassembling digital waste in Pakistan and Ghana. So again, we have here this split where care labor is feminized, is undervalued, but there are still multiple layers in which within that there is still a version of care labor, which is white, middle class, native English, and so on, which is more accepted and representational. And then there we have the invisibling of other labor. She also talks about how this is expressed with accent bias in the AI assistants of today, in which, of course, we want the perfect English accents, and she talks about imperialist speech technologies and so on. And another thing before I get to this about the AI assistants of today is that this process of sort of carrying and bringing up the AI that was put forward by Turing is kind of is switched. So rather than investing in and caring for AI and educating AI, we expect obviously a ready product that will be obedient, that will perform. And so there could be an idea that emotional labor is outsourced to these devices. And so they are performing the care labor in relation to people, but according to the paper, this is largely misleading because we interacting with these devices extensively perform immaterial labor, let's say in simple terms, feeding the algorithm and providing data to further improve and evolve these algorithms. And so in the next part, we are really getting to, where do we go from here and what kind of possibilities exist. And here we start to talk about care in a different way. So firstly, based on these researchers, Hobart and Nees, they describe care as relational feeling with rather than hierarchical. And they also conceptualize radical care, which is a set of vital but underappreciated strategies for enduring precarious worlds. And this concept of radical care draws on yet another concept of anthropology of the otherwise. And this is a kind of anthropology that locates itself within forms of life that are at odds with dominant and dominating modes of being. So Hobart and Neese highlight radical care's ability to engender and nurture modes of being that are at odds with current forms of care, that are shaped by existing structures of power and inequality. And another super interesting concept here is the idea of otherwise, which is related to double consciousness. And double consciousness locates second sight as registering the sensual, ethereal, oral, erotic images of another world that cannot be known or apprehended from post-Enlightenment thought. So for me, in simple terms, this is just resisting the mainstream and post-Enlightenment narrative. So resisting mainstream narratives and focusing more on lived experience and the central. Yeah, maybe we'll move on. There is a lot here. But this concept of otherwise is very important for this artwork by Stephanie Dinkins, which the author uses to explore alternatives to these hierarchical perpetuation of devaluation and feminization of care. And this work by Stephanie Dinkins is an AI which is embodied. It has this form of the sculpture, and it hosts memories from 3 generations of Black women from her family. So she says it is a voice interactive AI that has been designed, trained, and aligned with the needs and ideals of Black and Brown people who are drastically unrepresented in the tech sector. And here are some outputs by this AI. And Stephanie Dinkins actually gives her definition of algorithmic care, which she intends for this artwork to exemplify. So this is, I think this is a quote directly by Stephanie Dinkins, the artist. And she says, algorithmic care, often envisioned outside of the realm of what is technologically possible within artificial intelligence, is an essential aspect of human networks of information and resource sharing that aid our survival. Algorithmic care can engage voices that challenge the status quo to redress deep-seated historic and contemporary inequities, unearth other embedded problems, and model alternative pathways, and so on. And she also talks not only about a different kind of care, about post-care as a whole. And so post-care describes a specific mode of care where care labor is performed by technologized objects. So it's performed by potentially AI, but it also implies moving beyond care and away from the gender and racialized configurations of power that underpin white heterosexual models of care work. Oh, that's it. And so the work of Stephanie Dinkins challenges overall these expectations of servitude and the racialized hierarchy, because her AI is not obedient, is not easy to talk to, is sometimes difficult, it interrupts, it's sometimes negative. And part of her work is the fact that she cultivates a different relationship with it. So she actually has a relationship with her AI artwork that resembles what Turing envisioned in terms of educating the AI and starting with something like a child's brain. So she would encourage her AI model, she would stay positive and show a lot of patience. And that was sort of a way to enact this radical care and post-care. I think that covers the concepts of the paper. I did have a few other, it is a very dense paper, and I try to, offer some relevant concepts that I haven't encountered before, and I think they deserve more attention. But a few comments maybe from me, and then we can get into the discussion. In my essay that I wrote about this last year, I was observing actually how contemporary AI assistants are much more obedient and much more predictable than, let's say, 10 years ago. 10 years ago, there was, I think it was Ty by Microsoft around 10 years ago, which was known for being very rude on Twitter and unpredictable. And so there was still, even though the chatbot was feminized, it was still kind of unruly. And I think it's interesting to observe how much that was trained out of AI and how that's considered progress. So sort of alongside progress, we have increasing predictability and servitude and obedience from these feminized chatbots. The second point about Stephanie Dinkin's artwork is I find it very interesting and significant that she chose for her AI to be sort of embodied, to have a physical form. And I wonder about relationship between embodiment and agency. And I think it's much easier to model lack of agency if we have something that's immaterial, let's say. I have a few more, but maybe I'll open the floor.
I'm adding links to some of the stuff that we've mentioned so far, just randomly in the chat. But I do have some comments on your paper or the essay that you chose. I think it's maybe the second or third sentence in the first paragraph of the essay where it says 1950, Alan Turing's field establishing essay, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, embeds care labor, the work of raising, educating, and caring for another person, into the development and imaginaries of AI. And I immediately remembered the part of cyborg theory where a lot of white feminists decided or entertained the idea of allowing robots to be the ones that were responsible for not just rearing the children, but also bearing the children. And that was a very interesting concept. And funny enough, this morning I was doom scrolling on Instagram, as many of us do, and I saw this post where some conservative had posted a photo of a robot with a baby had it had a baby in the womb or a fetus in the womb, and it said something like, oh, ladies, look, even here you will be replaced. And a lot of women were commenting, thank God. So it's quite interesting how this concept that was part of a specific group of white feminism maybe a few decades ago is now coming back. And it reminds me of the ongoing joke for a lot of women, especially millennial women, saying we would all be mothers if we could all be fathers, or we'd all be parents or have kids if we could all be fathers. Because the difficult part of being a parent is always up to the woman. It doesn't matter how much of a feminist and equal partner your husband or other partner is, he can't carry the child. That's entirely on you. So that was a very interesting thing that came to mind when your essay that you chose was talking about automating care. There's some forms of care we just can't share at the moment. The other part was Federici. I thought it was very interesting that she came up. She wrote Caliban and the Witch, and I left the Wikipedia link for that. If you guys haven't encountered the book before, I highly recommend reading it. And the part that I'm surprised Eva didn't mention, but I know Eva covered a lot in that dense paper, but I know we both read that book, Caliban and the Witch, was how Federici talks about the fact that women were initially in healthcare at the beginning. They were in the birthing rooms. And when, due to capitalism and a desire to control women's bodies and women's pushing women to create more labor at different times throughout history, they decided to kick the women out of the birthing rooms, and men became the gynecologists. And so a lot of the historical knowledge that had been passed down for millennia were lost across multiple cultures, whether it was in indigenous communities or even in Europe. And a lot of that manifested as burning the witches, basically. If you look back at a lot of the women that were accused of being witches, they were just herbal doctors, and those were the same women who attended births. So they kicked the woman out of the profession. And it's quite interesting now to see the woman come back and to see it described as feminization, because while that is partially true, is it just feminization, or are we reclaiming something that was initially ours in the first place? I'm sure, of course, people go to school and they learn what they must, but I do lament everything that we probably lost during the campaign against these women who were responsible for this many years ago. And of course, we know we did very stupid things as humans back then. We didn't know about germs, and we had plagues and all sorts of things. I'm not saying that the healthcare at that time was perfect. Mortality rates were high for mothers and for children. But still, I'm sure that there was a lot within that we could have at least tested today, that we don't even have that opportunity because it was taken before we ever had that chance. So that was something else that came to mind with the book from Federici. Those are my two comments. Eva.
Yeah, I mean, when you mentioned that from Federici, I wonder if the same kind of dynamic played out with therapy, right? So I'm sure that there were women as witches, as healers, involved in kind of emotional care work traditionally as well. And so when the paper kind of begins, it's a moment where men somehow became the default therapists, maybe psychoanalysis was big as well. And so what's missing is that moment before, where possibly women were already displaced from those roles, we have men that dominate, and then when women enter the profession or re-enter the profession, if we zoom out, re-enter into this role, the whole perception of prestige and rigor of therapy as a field is instantly being devalued.
Yes, and even if you look at physical healthcare, biological healthcare, when women re-entered the field, it was in a lower position. You know, you don't have the same reverence for the nurse and other fields or professions that are dominated by women as you do for Mr. Doctor, which is almost always a man. So, yes, women came back into healthcare, but in what roles and in what positions? And even in mental health care, if you think about that, yes, the women are there in mental health, but I think that, and I don't have the numbers on this is purely my observation, so don't quote me on it, but I do feel that women tend to aim for psychology. I want to be a psychologist, I want to be a therapist, I want to be a psychoanalyst. But when you look for the psychiatrist, who is still an MD, that is a man a lot of the times. So there's still a huge division in the level, let's say, that they go for. And the psychiatrist does have a lot more position, power, prestige than a psychologist, because, for instance, in most jurisdictions around the world, the psychologist cannot prescribe medication. That is still something that has to be done by a psychiatrist or somebody else who has MD after their name. So even then, when women flock to the field as psychologists, they're still under the control of whoever the psychiatrist is or whoever the doctor is, not your doctor of psychology, doctor of philosophy, but your medical doctor. So it's interesting how once we returned or entered the field, it was reorganized to ensure that even though we now had well-paying jobs and secure employment, that wasn't the kind of precarious employment that women had previously when they were secretaries and data entry clerks and all of that. Even then, there was still this hierarchy that the woman occupied as opposed to the men, stereotypically. And Anne says, when men replaced women, the care was not as empathetic to the women. Drug them, ignore their pain, lie down while you are giving birth. That is very true. And the United States certainly has a reputation for not listening to women. And a lot of women have been later diagnosed with cancer and more serious things, who previously went to the doctors and said, hey, I have a headache. Hey, I don't feel well. And there was just this assumption that the women are being emotional and they're send her home and give her aspirin and she'll be fine. There's many documented instances of that. So I do agree with Anne that when the men took over the positions that had more say, more power, more prestige, we lost a lot of the empathy as well. And Eva, I don't know if you wanted to comment on what Alina said. I'll go back up to her message. She said, is therapy really devalued when they can charge you $80 for a 45-minute session? Any thoughts?
In the US, it can be $600.
$600 for 1 hour?
Yeah.
45 minutes? I haven't seen that, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Without insurance.
Ah, that is interesting.
For LMFT, right, which is a licensed marriage and family therapist, which is a very, very expensive degree to get, that people go into debt for. So there is an element of structural inequality and privilege, like wherever you look. But another comment I wanted to make is related to the essay that I wrote last year, in which I was talking about companion AI, so like AI girlfriends and so on, but not only, also therapy So exactly all of those AI applications that attend to emotional needs. And these companion applications have a global market of $8 billion, or had last year. And so the reflection here is that this care labor is programmed into AI for decades, and it's not going away. And it has been one of the main, I think, the first or the second most popular kind of usage of AI last year. So if you have a market of $8 billion, that would suggest this kind of work is actually very highly valued. But in what context? After it has been first devalued when it's performed by women, then taken by developers and productized and automated, so turn into an app and a product. Then definitely it has value again in the marketplace, because it's something really sought after. That is one of the major features of many applications.
There's another aspect of how AI in healthcare overall, not necessarily mental health, just AI in healthcare, how, at least in a global setting, it's also leading to more stratifications as far as by racial and ethnic groups, or the global north versus the global south, or developed versus underdeveloped and developing countries. But in those poor nations, AI is being deployed more because there are fewer restrictions against it in a lot of instances. And there have been some progress in reducing the cost of healthcare so that more people have access to it, and it has saved lives and improved outcomes for a lot of people. But I think there's still the ethical question of what are they doing that might be untested? What is the rate of medical errors that are happening with these people? Of course, yeah, you're saving lives as opposed to them not getting any health care at all, but it doesn't change the fact that you're putting people at risk at the end of the day. And it's just, it's kind of sad because AI we might find a situation where more privileged nations will be the ones who can afford to pay for the human doctors, human healthcare, or to keep a human in the loop at least. And a situation where the global south and underdeveloped or developed countries gets a fully automated model because there are no restrictions against it, and in a lot of places it might be better to have something than nothing at all. And that's another way that I think healthcare can create some, or AI in healthcare can create some form of inequity and inequality. And I'm not really sure how to address that because, again, what's better, having nothing at all or having something questionable? It's worth considering. I think that I'm gonna put the book in the chat, but I think this is one of the books I encountered in grad school, my master's, that talked about it or had one of the case studies. I think it was this one. What to do when machines do everything. So yeah. Anything else you wanted to add to your paper or your essay, Eva?
I'm good. Any other comments from our participants? Or if not, then we can give you the floor.
I don't have any notes on 11. And Maria would have done 12 if she had been able to attend today. And 12 would have been the false binary of reason and emotion in data visualization. And it truly is tragic that Maria had to miss this session for two reasons. The first is that Maria is a data scientist by trade, as well as a computer scientist, but she's worked in data science for many years. She teaches data science. And so her expertise to discuss data visualization would have been very interesting. And the other is that her PhD, I always describe it wrong, but it's something like quantifying emotion or categorizing emotion, not specifically for AI use, but it could be used later for AI, whether it's in a healthcare setting or whatever else. So, you know, from two angles, she would have been a good option to discuss this paper. I'm just going to run through it quickly. I will never understand it or discuss it as well as she could. But it starts with talking about Periscopic's work, which framed, they created a very compelling, emotionally compelling graphic for death by guns in the United States. And actually, I will just go ahead and share the paper. And you can see some of my highlights yourself. And it says, in spite of its statistical rigor and undeniable emotional impact, there was a lot of blowback against the way that they chose to illustrate this information. And one of the things that they did was they showed the number of deaths that were lost to gun violence in the US, but they also estimated the number of years of life that people lost as a result of being gunned down, whether it was in school or supermarket. Anyone can die anywhere in the US thanks to gun violence. So the question was from the data visualization community, are you allowed to have visualization that evokes emotion? And a lot of professionals said, absolutely not. That is not what data is for, what data science is for, what visualizing data is for. And there was this push for a more neutral approach to sharing data, providing data to other people. But as the person who wrote this paper pointed out, there is no such thing. Even when you look at data that was done plainly with no colors and nothing else, the design choices that's a researcher or journalist or whoever makes when they present data in terms of the specific graph that they use and what that specific thing emphasizes, all of those persuade a reader in some direction or another. So there's no such thing as a completely unbiased data visualization. So what is the point then if it's going to serve some kind of purpose beyond objectivity? So it says here, some who pushed for objectivity, they said quantification is a technology of distance. And distance was historically imagined to serve objectivity by producing knowledge independently of the people that make it. And I'm sure Eva has encountered this because I certainly have. When you do qualitative research, this is one of the criticisms that you kind of run into, because there is this push, even in the social sciences, to quantify things. And that is not always the best way to share data. And again, what is the point of sharing data? Are we just informing people, or are we informing them with the intention of pushing for some kind of change? You know, like the whole point of the US gun violence data visualization, for instance, was to show people how bad the situation is. Not that we don't know, but sometimes it helps to see it quantified as opposed to just seeing it on the news. And it also pulled on this belief that women are more emotional than men, and by contrast, that men are more reasoned than women. It is one of the most persistent stereotypes in the world today. Indeed, psychologists have called it the master stereotype, puzzling over how it endures even when certain emotions, even extreme ones like anger and pride, are simultaneously coded as male. So it's again interesting that STEM kind of gears towards that kind of, we must be neutral, we must be objective, we must be rational, but also by extension, we must be masculine. And that may once again be one of the reasons that women do not particularly flock towards STEM at the rate that they do to other fields. This also talks about a specific experiment that I want to read. Okay, It's called A Sort of Joy. And my screen just went out. Okay, came back. A Sort of Joy. And it starts by discussing the fact that there are not a lot of great women artists in museums. And not that these great female artists do not exist, but that history had not bothered to collect their artwork or to give them the space in the same way that men's work were collected. And if we go even further back, we can also point to the fact that a lot of women never had the opportunity to have hobbies and talent in the arts because they were busy doing feminized labor, raising the kids at the time. So the experiment, A Sort of Joy, deploys wholly different tactics to similar ends. And they're referring to sharing data in a way that moves people as opposed to just being like pretending to be objective, since no form of data is completely objective. So the performance starts with a group of white men standing in a circle in the center of the room. They face out towards the audience, which stands around them. The men are dressed like stereotypical museum visitors, wearing collared shirts and slacks. They all have headphones on and hold an iPad on which the names of artists in the collection scroll across the screen. And then the men say, John, and they scroll through all the different names that are John. John Baldessari, John Cage, John Lennon, John Waters, and so on. And they keep going like that for a while. So the audience is confused because what exactly is the point of this? What kind of artistic performance? Another weird thing. Who came up with this? Why are they just randomly speaking somebody's name? It makes no sense. And why are those women walking around so intently but saying nothing? But then eventually they get to M and somebody says Mary. And when the crowd finally hears a female or feminine name is when they have that aha moment of, oh, this is what we're getting to, is that you have to get through all these examples of male names or these records of male names before you get to even one woman whose contribution was recognized. And when the highly gendered nature of the collection is revealed, from that point on, the audience members start to listen very differently because now they are also eagerly waiting for the next female name. It took more than 3 minutes for the name Mary to be spoken, and the next female name, Joan, does not come for another full minute. And then it's goes on again until you finally get to Barbara, but then that's also followed by more male names, which are Werner, Tony, Marcel, Jonathan. So of course, they could have just illustrated this in a bar graph, right? These are how many names are male, these are how many names are female, or you pick a random sample of names and this is how many Johns we had and how many Peters and Marys. But it would not have had the same effect of having to stand in silence and listen to this group recite male names for 3 minutes before you finally hear a female one. So this was another example of why if you're creating data or visualizing data and sharing data with the intent of making it useful and provoking or evoking some kind of a response from people, then why should it be objective? And cornering ourselves into this idea of it has to be gray and dark and cold and STEM looking isn't very helpful in the long run. So I thought this paper was really, really interesting. And I'm sorry that Maria wasn't here to do it justice.
Well, you did a good job.
Thank you. Thank you. I tried. Alina has a question. Isn't estimated years lost to gun violence more informative than the number of deaths? Yes, I would agree. But the comparison of those two numbers was interesting. It's right here. I don't know if you can still see my screen, but for 2013, by then they arrived at 11,419 people killed, which sounds bad already, but sounds even worse when they add 502,025 stolen years. So 500,000 stolen years gone. So more informative, but not necessarily factual as well, which is the other part of it, right? They're just estimating. You'd never know precisely how long somebody would live for. They could have died the next day. So it is speculative. And that is one of the things that people who critiqued this or criticize this thing really said is that it's not factual. So how dare you propose this to be data? But nevertheless, I think it did a really good job of showing people the severity of the situation. Alina says that's almost 50 years lost average per death, a lot of young deaths.
Yes.
Yes. And there is one actually, let me see if I can find it. It's right here where it says Alexander Lipkins, killed at 29, could have lived to be 93. So that is an example. They just projected the number of years. So it's not factual, but it is a good educated guess and serves the purpose of, I think, moving people in the right direction, although that has done us no good so far in the US. I see Anne shaking her head, exactly. But moving in the right direction as far as raising awareness. I would say it has been successful enough that at least everybody else in the world now knows it's a problem. It's just a matter of waiting for the Americans to do something about it. And Anne says, it depends on what message you are trying to share using data. Deaths are a verified fact. Potential years lost is also powerful and uses data to come to that number. I agree. And I think also if we only share data that we could, or only use and value data that we can prove beyond any doubt, so many fields would not exist. Data science would not exist. Marketing research, when your doctor says you have a 60% probability of surviving this surgery, none of those things would exist. These are all based on estimates, and they serve a purpose. Deciding that because your doctor can't say you're sure to die tomorrow at 5 o'clock right after this surgery, it doesn't mean that the number or the data isn't valid. So anyways, I will hop off my pedestal for 12. And I don't have any notes in any of the others until mine. Was that you, Emma?
Just one comment on that. On that paper from me, I think it talked a lot about, glorifying rationality over emotions, right? And I just wanted to mention a book that I think is really relevant, which is called Intimacies, The Making of Emotional Capitalism. And this is by a sociologist called Eva Illouz, and she talks about hierarchy of emotions, which is structuring our capitalist society, also in the context of work and so on. But she says, to be a man of character requires one to display courage, cool-headed rationality, and disciplined aggressiveness. Femininity, on the other hand, demands kindness, compassion, and cheerfulness. These divisions produce emotional hierarchies, whereby cool-headed rationality is usually deemed more reliable, objective, and professional than, say, compassion. So there is a resistance against injecting compassion into data as kind of, weakness of it, perceived weakness, which we could say stems from this hierarchy of emotion that is structuring late capitalist society.
I agree. And I think that does tie back once more to how the professions are separated. Psychiatry, for instance, prescribing medication to somebody is, it's not a fully yes or no thing, but it's closer to the STEM side of healthcare, right? And psychology is not. That's definitely it requires more soft skills than psychiatry does. And it's interesting that psychiatry is the more masculine version, and psychology, again, is the more feminine version of mental health. So that's an interesting thing. So that was 12. And I don't think either of us have notes on anything from 12 to 20. I have 21. But if anyone had checked the other papers and they have something to say about the other papers, or you want to add to something that we've already discussed, the floor is yours.
I would just encourage to look into Cruel Optimism, which is chapter 15. It's just really, I think, a helpful lens to understand the narratives that are shaping the AI discussion. And so this is from scholar Lauren Berland. And here the author applies this to AI, but she says, AI promises a seductive escape from historical human biases through abstract smartness and impartial governance, which is highly appealing to marginalized groups who have suffered under human-run systems. The optimism is cruel because investing in AI continuously harms the vulnerable populations it promises to liberate. And algorithms consistently reproduce and exacerbate structural divisions of race, class, and gender. So I just found that cruel aspect of it really accurate and helpful to understand what is going on.
Yeah, the quote actually reminds me of something that Ruha Benjamin said. I just looked for the quote, or at least my paraphrasing of it. It was outsourcing decisions to algorithms. When companies do that, they have rebranded profit maximization as discrimination minimization. Painting technology as value free makes people less likely to question the disparity that it produces. And yeah, I'll end there. But I thought that was an interesting observation from Ruha as well. It's like scapegoating in a way. Oh, it's not us, it's the algorithm, and who knows how it came to that decision. And thankfully, probably one of the very, well, not probably, I'm sure it's one of the very big reasons that AI is not, or AI and algorithms are not allowed to make certain decisions in the European Union. If you can't explain how you get that answer, you can't just say, well, we don't know. The model came up with it. You do have to provide an actual explanation. Whereas in the US, that's not the case, right? For the benefit of convenience, you can get an immediate answer as to whether or not you deserve this credit card. And if you don't get it, they'll give you some generic answer like, well, it's probably your credit score. And then the letter comes and your credit score is 800 and you're confused as to what this had to do with anything. And if you're not in the US and you're not familiar with US credit scores, 800 is phenomenal. Phenomenal credit score. But anyways, my rant is over. And we will move on to 21, but we will still make time for questions if you have any afterwards. So 21 is design practices, nothing about us without us, and it is by Sasha Costanza Chalk, who uses they them pronouns. And I must try to remember this because I didn't know this until last night when I was looking up the person. But they are a US communications scholar, author, and activist. They are a non-binary trans femme. They research participatory design, social movements, media, and communications technologies, and have published work about design justice, Occupy Wall Street, the immigrant rights movement in the US, and communications rights, media policies, among other areas. So they're very active in that sector. I chose this paper or this essay because I felt it was the one that had the most direct applications to now and to designing current systems. This wasn't specifically talking about AI at all, to be perfectly honest, but it was applicable to AI. It was about design. And I think almost all of us encounter design in some way in our work or even in our research. So that's where I'll begin. So Costanza Chalk evaluates the history of participatory design and disability justice, advocating for a shift from a tendency of designing for a community to community-led approach of designing with the community. So the text concludes with findings from the More Than Code project, or hashtag More Than Code, emphasizing that true justice requires community, accountability, ownership of the design processes, and a commitment to sustaining existing movements rather than parachuting in with new solutions. And I will touch on all of that a bit more as we go on. So, one of the most important things that they talked about was user centered design. And that is a design process that is based on an explicit understanding of users, the tasks, and the environments. It's driven and refined by user centered evaluation and addresses the whole user experience. However, one of the downsides to this approach, which sounds so amazing at the start, is that um, it tends to center the needs of some users above others. It's just not possible for you to find all your users. And so essentially, the ones who get centered or the needs of the ones that are centered will be the ones of whoever you found. And that's usually the majority population. Um, so that's one of the downsides of that. The other thing that she talked about, or that they talked about, was paid preference, and that all human beings design, but not everyone gets paid to do so because society and corporations prioritize and compensate for paid design labor, even when marginalized people contribute to the design process. So they talked about multiple instances where big corporations, like say Microsoft or Google, they go into communication, go into communities, and they have these workshops where people come up with different solutions for different problems. And the Microsoft or Google or whoever designers, they take those ideas, they bring it back, they make the product, they sell it, and that same community now has to buy the solution that they helped provide this amazing innovating idea for. So in one way, it's great that they got to contribute to the process, but they never received credit for it, and they never received compensation for the work that they did. And it's not like the company then decided to make it free for them or accessible to everyone else. In most instances, it's just used to milk, the capitalist system to provide more money for the company. There's also a failure to meaningfully diversify. So, despite steadily increasing interest in establishing a diverse pool of designers, developers, product managers, and other tech workers, the industry has failed to meaningfully diversify. And I think it was a last meeting that Maria, Eva, and I talked about even how all of us had left tech in one way or another, or chose tech adjacent roles over tech, because they have more than a supply chain issue, there's also a retention issue. So even when schools and organizations have been successful at attracting women and marginalized groups into STEM, a lot of us simply do not stay. And that is something that they really need to resolve. Um, the paper also talks about lean and agile product design, and how this was a good improvement because it replaced the top down approach of previous methods. So, if you are familiar with product management, product design, project management, I think most of us have encountered waterfall method, and that method is very rigid. Very rigid, and basically the project manager and the stakeholders, the main stakeholders, come up with this plan of how they're going to do things, and they execute it exactly how they decided, and there's no input from the user. Even if they're building this solution for a company, the company has a say when the product is basically done. There's no input from them usually throughout the process, unless it's at the very beginning. They stick to the plan. So using a more agile product design turned out to be better because it created space for user input. A user could decide that ABC sounds like a great plan at the beginning, and once they have encountered the design or encountered a change in their work environment, maybe BCD is better. And unless they have the opportunity to interact with the product at different stages or to introduce a change at different stages, then the end product might not meet the needs of users at all. And they said that even though lean and agile product design was an improvement, none of the new agile methods have much of anything to say about accountability, ownership, profit sharing, or giving vulnerable populations credit for their role in innovations that big tech monetizes. So, in the same instance I described before with the workshops, where a lot of these companies go into the communities and they work with them to get the product done, and then they just take the product and go monetize it for themselves. So even when they use an agile product design approach, it still doesn't change the fact that there is a huge imbalance to the relationship, and one side is profiting at the expense of the other. The other problem is imagined users. So designers tend to default to an imagined user, or what we would call user personas, which you'll see in product design, marketing, sales. A lot of business fields rely on user personas, and those experiences are usually similar to our own. So if Eva is designing something, Eva will probably just by default um, choose something similar to her own. So give good example was when Eva just talked about the essay that she wrote about care and AI, and she thought of it from the feminized perspective, but hadn't gotten to the racialized perspective until she saw the essay that was in the book this time. So it's just inherent in us as human beings to tend to
Thanks for
default.
calling me out again. But I called myself out because I thought it was important.
Yeah, we just default. Or in my case with my PhD research, I chose to study AI and automation, how it impacts women and marginalized persons, which is me. So I chose the target audience that I could relate to. So this is something that is just inherent in us as humans. And when we have the opportunity to design solutions, or even to observe problems or study problems, we just tend to default to what is most familiar to ourselves. So this means that users are most often assumed to be members of the dominant and hence unmarked group. And in the United States, this usually means a cis male who is white, heterosexual, able bodied, literate, college educated. And the reason this is the default that people would move towards is because those are the people who are dominating product design, tech, all of this on the back end of the products that we have now, whether it's AI or a children's toy. This persona's needs tend to be centered over young children, the elderly, and less privileged populations. And this produces a spiral of exclusion, as essentially designers are centering the most socially and economically powerful users. An interesting finding, though, is that diversifying design and technology teams, even though it's a great first step, it doesn't really solve anything, because an interesting phenomena that researchers found is that even the diverse people, when asked to create user personas or to envision a target audience, they still tend to envision whatever is dominant in the group that within they operate. So if you have one black person or one Asian person or one woman on a team full of white male developers, product designers, let's say in the United States or a European country where the country is predominantly white, even in with the one person who represents the diversity on the team, or two or three, there is still a tendency to default to what the norm is, whether it is the norm in the office or the norm in the society. So just diversifying people, just throwing, we are a diverse team. We hired a black person. We hired a woman. We have a woman in our developers team. Doesn't really solve the problem. I do wonder though if it is genuinely a situation, there's a helicopter. If it's genuinely a situation where minorities envision the majority, or marginalized people still envision the majority, or is it a situation where they are not comfortable enough to speak up, where they feel if they suggest something that is specifically for their demographic, they may be ridiculed for it. They may have done so several times before and have been told it's just not a profitable ask. It's not something that will really benefit the company. The target market for that is too niche. So I do wonder if it's really that when you diversify a group, they still envision the whoever the dominant population is, or is it that they just don't feel comfortable to push their ideas forward? There is also the undervaluing of women and their contributions, which Eva and I have discussed throughout the book so far. So, according to Asaro, gender inequality shapes participation in design processes. In many work contexts, the positions traditionally occupied by women are often viewed as being of lower value by management and unions. This undervaluing of women's work easily overflows into inequalities of participation in design activities, especially when combined with social prejudices that view technology design as a masculine pursuit. Unless gender issues in the design process are recognized and dealt with, there exists a strong possibility of gender inequalities being built into the technology itself. And one observation that I have made, and I don't think that I really recognized it until I moved to Spain in 2024, was that I know a lot of women who work in tech, and almost all of those women, especially in um, in Spain and for a long time, including myself, work as project managers, product managers. And it's interesting because those are the communications roles in tech. So even when they're on the design team, they're not the ones doing the coding. They're the ones that are managing the men who are doing the codings. So I just think it's an interesting way of spreading the task. And it makes me wonder what the impact of that is, because I mean the product manager and the project manager, they have a lot of say in how things turn out, but it's still interesting to me that the role that requires all the soft skills, or a lot of soft skills, once again goes to the woman, and the masculine pursuit of the coding, the actual doing of the sketches and whatever, all of that still goes to the men. So, I mean, you can tell them what to do, but at the end of the day, they're the ones doing it. And they can come back and say, this isn't plausible, these numbers don't match, this is the way that it has to work. And unless you have the technical skills, you might not be in a position to challenge that. So, that was something interesting I have seen. Um, there are also potential harms in using the user personas. And this is because the personas themselves can be harmful, and a lot of them are built on abstractions of communities that are not actually able to contribute to the discussion. And what that leads to is just you've built stereotypes of what you think people want. I am Jamaican, so therefore, when you make me a shirt, it should have a huge marijuana sign on it and some Rastaman with a joint, because that must be what I like. Yeah, exactly. See, you laugh, but you would be amused by how many times that is a
But you
stereotype.
but you wear that shirt every day.
No,
What's the
every day.
problem?
I'm wearing it right now. So yeah, so people, if you don't discuss or have a collaboration with the community that you're building something for, you really do run the risk of having stereotypes of how you think they live, what you think they want, what you think they will value. So, this can lead to technologies built to serve the stereotypes of a group instead of the group's actual needs and actual preferences. Even so, user personas can be useful as they help designers stay focused on the specific use case, and they often lead to better design outcomes than when they don't use them. And the difficult part is helping designers to see the weaknesses of the process so that they can focus on the strengths, because using personas tends to feel inclusive even when it isn't. And even when designers draw the idea of the person out of thin air instead of actually interviewing and interacting with members of the community. One instance where I've seen that in my research so far is this book by Diana Forsyth. And she was an anthropologist of artificial intelligence who spent about 8 years in a lab observing AI scientists. And they worked in a medical context and built. products for medical use, for doctors, for patients. And a lot of these products failed. And they couldn't seem to figure out why the products failed, why they weren't meeting user needs. And as she was there observing it, they didn't actually talk to the doctors and they didn't talk to the patients. These AI scientists who work in a completely different area felt that they understood, they know what the users need, they know what the doctor needs. And so they came up with their own solutions and they built a product to serve these people, which failed to serve the people. And no matter how many times the products failed, they would still continue to follow this path. And she described it as an I am the world way of viewing other people. And it seemed, even when she suggested to them, hey, I do ethnography and I interview people. Have you thought of maybe interviewing the people so that you can have a better idea of what they want? And the AI scientists were appalled that they should be asked to do such a thing. And once again, this was probably being appalled because it required soft skills. And one of her speculations was that um, it was like they felt it was too messy to involve human interactions because they couldn't quantify it, but they were still willing to make inaccurate assumptions themselves. So that's interesting if anybody here works in product design and wants to see disaster in action. Yeah, Alina says talking to people, inconceivable. Exactly. um, but ultimately, pretending to be another kind of person is not a good solution for design teams that want to minimize discrimination. Um, and an example that the paper gave was a person who does not have a physical disability navigating an environment in a wheelchair to understand, supposedly, how people navigate the space in a wheelchair. Obviously, this person doesn't have a real disability, so they have full movements and can get around just fine. So the way that they navigate with the chair is not actually representative of somebody who does. And a good example that I have seen of this, I wish I had been able to find the video. I did look. There was this company, I don't remember if it was in China, but they came up with this AI chair that was supposed to help improve mobility for people who use a wheelchair. And it was very easy to use it, no hands. You just had to move just a little and it would nudge the chair to go in a certain direction. It was nice. People loved it, except for the people that they built it for, because the chair had no back support. And so, if it was actually going to be used by somebody who needed a wheelchair, it would need back support. So, it looked cool. And I'm sure maybe they did a similar thing of let's have somebody who does not have a disability or need for a wheelchair navigate a space and design around that. But because they did that, allegedly, supposedly, we're hypothesizing here, they built a solution that didn't solve anybody's problem. It was just a cool chair. It still needed back support for somebody who actually needed a chair to find it useful. So this is why designing with the community in mind is so much more effective for meeting user needs. Another lesson from disability activism is that involving members of the community that is most directly affected by a design process, like wheelchair users in this example, is crucial, both because justice demands it and also because the tacit and experiential knowledge of community members is sure to produce the ideas, approaches, and innovations that a non-member of the community would be extremely unlikely to come up with. However, design teams and companies often include diverse persons at the early product design stages and then capitalize on their ideas and suggestions without any compensation or additional feedback. And an interesting way that the paper conceptualized this problem is if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And it reminds me of the statement that was applied to AI and LLMs a lot when we first got them and they were free. Is if it's free, it's because you're the product. And both of them, I think, illustrate this exploitive relationship between tech and users, even though it is two different contexts. So, design justice is one of the main recommendations that the author advocates for. It's a new way of thinking about making things like apps, tools, and AI. And it points out that most tech today is made for a small group of average or normal people, which leaves everybody else out. And the chapter argues that just hiring a diverse team isn't enough, as we already discussed. Instead, the people who are most affected by the problem should be the ones leading the design process. And design justice compels us to begin by listening to community organizers, learning what they are working on, and asking what the most useful focus of design efforts would be. And I do think they talked about parachuting in an idea. And it is this tendency that we have, people from more privileged populations. Sadly, I have to include myself since I now live in Europe. But this tendency we have of parachuting the solution into an area. We are not in the area, but we have seen the problem and we've decided we know what's best. And so we show up and we drop the solution at everybody's head, and that solves the problem, and we're gone before we have to deal with the effects of that solution. And that is one of the problems that the authors point to. So they say a lot of the times when people come in and they try to, or outsiders try to parachute a solution into the community, one of the things it fails to account for is whether or not there was an existing solution that was being proposed. And maybe that solution didn't go very far, wasn't very visible because they didn't have the resources and the amount of support that they needed. But these new people come in and they reinvent the wheel when they could have just spoken to the community and asked them, what are you currently working on that needs to be amplified, improved, supported to get the right solution? So design justice practitioners choose to work in solidarity with and amplify the power of community-based organizations. This is unlike many other approaches to product design, in which designers partner with a community but tend to retain power in the process. And the author also proposes locally governed, environmentally sustainable technologies that could be adapted to the context within which they are embedded. So basically what I explained before, that sometimes the community already has a solution, it just doesn't have the amount of support and resources that it needs to be successful. And that's basically it. That was the most important part of the paper. I'm done. I see some comments in the chat. Oh, some of the comments are from the previous discussions. So I'll stop here. And Eva, did you want to add anything to 21?
Yeah, that's a great overview, I think, from my personal experience in tech. As you were talking, I was reflecting on the gap between inclusion, representation, and like performing of inclusion and representation. Maybe so when I worked for an American tech company which served 5 million users, the team would have no racial diversity, basically. And this was not a concern at all. I don't think we ever considered race or disability as something to keep in mind in terms of design process, except, maybe occasionally a UX designer would say, we need to increase the contrast on this, or things like that because of usability. So just like basic usability. But at least I don't remember any kind of inclusion or consideration for those topics in the design process. However, when it comes a moment to put out a blog post, when it comes a moment to have a picture, we need to make sure that we have diversity, right? We need to have in our marketing materials different kinds of people, different kinds of faces, so that everyone feels represented. But there is no, it's just a wrapping paper. But there is kind of, in terms of design process or inclusion, totally hollow.
Agreed. I experienced that as well in my PM days. It's interesting that you mentioned the UX designer because that rings true for me as well. It was always me and our UX person that were always pointing out things that no one bothered to care about, like using the two colors that are going to cause problems for people who are colorblind, or there was this time they wanted to redo the logo and they had this weird blurring in it that looked cool, but at the same time, not everybody is going to be able to read that, or they chose a background for the website and didn't consider that maybe older users or again people with vision impairment would not be able to read that. Another time, they wanted to, I forget what it was that they wanted to add. But anyways, there was multiple examples where the UX designer and myself had to point out that from a disability perspective, this didn't make sense. Oh, and this flashing lights thing they had at one time, they wanted to put on the website, and we had to remind them that that can trigger people who have who get seizures. They have epilepsy. So a lot of people don't really think about that. The interesting thing though, I did covered this in a Coursera course. I'm trying to remember exactly which one it was, and I really don't. It may have been a project management course with Google, but they talked about how a lot of the things that we take as everyday convenience for quote unquote normal people are were actually initially built for people with disabilities. For example, being able to talk to your phone, speech to text, that was initially for people who could not type. They didn't have mobility in their hands. Um, and even the reverse of um, text to speech was for people who couldn't see. But we take those things for granted now. They're just normal things that are part of convenience, but they weren't initially built for us. Even closed captioning. The older you get, the more you need to see the words on the screen. Even though you can hear perfectly well, it's so weird not to see it. Or the convenience of being able to watch a YouTube video or an Instagram video and be able to just read the captions rather than turn the video on and look for your headphones, or turn the sound on and look for your headphones. So I think that the argument a lot of companies give that this is a niche request and it doesn't benefit everyone and who's going to use this is kind of ironic given how so many of the technologies and features we take for granted now came from somebody speaking up on behalf of people with disabilities or other forms of impairment. And let's see, Elena says, I couldn't get through a show nowadays without closed captions. Amen. Amen. Yes, absolutely. And I'm going to scroll back up to see if we missed any additional comments. Elena, maybe because they were educated by teachers who presumed the user persona should reflect the dominant population. Were you referring to um, diverse populations or to the quote unquote dominant group, Elena? Who were the ones that were educated by the teachers who presumed the user persona should reflect the dominant population? I think when I did marketing in undergrad, oh, when someone from a diverse group still imagines someone from the dominant group as the target. I don't think that's a false assumption. I don't think the teachers specifically said, um, this is the group that you should always design for, but every company has a target market, and the target market is never the niche group. It is whoever they have decided is their most likely user, and that is almost always going to be reflective of the dominant population unless they're making a niche item. So we will envision people with disabilities because we're making a wheelchair, or we will envision people with a hearing impairment because we're making hearing aids. But outside of that, most companies are trying to target not just the majority, because they can milk it, but oftentimes also who has the most money, who is willing to spend the most money. And we see that now with how cars are designed in the US. In the past, there were more budget-friendly cars under 20 or $30,000, and now increasingly cars are costing 40, 50, $60,000 in the US, which is a new a new change of affairs. And I think it's because companies are increasingly looking for who they can milk more in late stage capitalism. Anyways, end of rant. Let's see what else is in here in the comments.
Yeah, I don't know if people know that, but zip codes are also a big part of that equation in terms of targeting people and how
Yep.
valuable users are.
Yep.
In my past tech experience, like a lot of the understanding and presumption about the persona was based on zip code data in the
Yep.
US.
Yep. Absolutely. And also how redlining happened in the US, where some communities, for real estate purposes, these were decided, it was decided that these communities were profitable and we should keep the prices high for this market. And then other communities were less important. And regardless of the actual value of the home, it was just depreciated by a lot. That was also unfortunate. I also think, do you remember when we did algorithmic harm, Eva, with Bargill and Sunstein? And they talked about how models can discriminate by proxy. So you could tell a model or train a model you absolutely cannot discriminate against somebody applying for a credit card or some other form of credit by race, but the model has access to your zip code when you put your address in, and it can make a pretty good educated guess as to your race based on the community that you lived in and the levels of segregation that are still present in US populations. So it was nice having you, Lucia.
Oh,
So yeah,
Lucia left. But
yeah, left as well. I mean, it's about that time. It's 7:02. So does anyone else have any comments about the topics that we've covered so far? Since Maria did not come, we do have a shorter meeting. So it's okay if it ends now, I think. But the floor is still open for
by
questions.
shorter, you mean we didn't go over by 1 hour?
Yeah, I know, exactly. Because there's just two of us. Going once, going twice. Okay. Well, thank you to, well, wait, Eva, did you have anything else to say before I wrap up?
Happy to finish on time, but thanks everyone. Great discussion. And Tessina, you can share about what's coming up.
Yes. So this is the last month of the quarter, so a new one will start tomorrow, basically. And thank you. Thank you. So the first month we will start with voting. So maybe in a week or so, we'll have a list of about 4 books that will go out with the Google form, and you guys can choose from those 4 books which one we will work on next. And then we will announce our paper session, which will be the second month of the quarter. And you can attend the paper session. The paper, we always choose a paper that is related to the topic or that the same author wrote that paper as well. So much shorter content to cover. And then we'll have another book session again at the last month of the quarter like we're doing now. So watch your emails. We will send that information out. That's about it. Thank you guys. It was great to see you again, Alina. And I'm sure Maria will join us next week. We send her best wishes to everyone. Or next time.
Thanks. Okay. Yeah, next time.